History doesn't always turn on a battlefield. Sometimes it turns on a single fateful moment of bad luck. For England, that moment may have come in 1064 on the storm-tossed waters of the English Channel. On board a ship was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law to the king, and by far the most powerful man in the kingdom. We don't know for certain why he was sailing, though it's been speculated that he may have been on a diplomatic mission. Whatever his purpose, it was cut short by a violent squall. The ship was blown hopelessly off course, smashing onto the shores of Ponthieu, a small but hostile territory ruled by Count Guy. Harold, the most powerful man in England, was dragged from the surf and taken prisoner. The Count seized him based on the laws of wreck, a brutal custom that essentially made any valuable cargo, or person, washed ashore the property of the local lord. Harold was thrown into a dungeon at Boran, a prisoner to be ransomed. Word of this prize spread quickly. To the south in Normandy, Duke William heard the news. William, a ruthless and ambitious ruler, immediately saw his opportunity. William dispatched messengers, applied a heavy dose of threats, and demanded that the Count hand Harold over. The Count, who was also a vassal of the French king, was cowed by his powerful Norman neighbor and had absolutely no choice but to comply. Harold was quote-unquote rescued from this prison, only to be delivered into the hands of a far more dangerous man. Godwinson was now the guest of Duke William of Normandy, whether he liked it or not. William was a master political operator. He knew he couldn't just keep Harold in a dungeon as his previous captor had done. He treated Harold not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor, at least the same way that a turkey might be called the guest of honor at a Thanksgiving dinner. He invited Harold to join him on a military campaign into neighboring Brittany against Duke Conan. During this campaign, Harold, a renowned warrior in his own right, proved his worth. In a famous scene, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, two of William's soldiers were trapped in the quicksand near the fortress of Mont Saint-Michel. It was Harold who waded in, reportedly pulling both men to safety with his bare hands. After they successfully besieged Duke Conan at Dinan, William celebrated his guest as a brother in arms. He presented Harold with gifts of weapons and armor, a public and deeply symbolic act. In the 11th century feudal world, this was no simple gesture. A lord gave arms to his vassal. William was, in full view of his court, maneuvering Harold into a subordinate role, creating a public spectacle of obligation. This carefully constructed friendship was the backdrop for William's real goal. But to understand how he used it, we must fast forward 2 years to the event that set all of England on fire, January 5th, 1066. King Edward the Confessor, old and childless, died. His death created a power vacuum, a succession crisis that would pit various claimants against each other for the English crown. On January 6, 1066, the day after Edward's death, England's leading nobles and bishops convened the Witenagemot, the Great Council of the realm. Their job wasn't to automatically follow a line of succession, but to elect the man best suited to defend the kingdom. The obvious choice was Harold Godwinson. He was the wealthiest, most powerful, and most respected military leader in England. According to contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources, Edward even made it clear that he viewed Godwinson as his natural successor, a non-determinative factor to be considered. The council elected Harold Godwinson, and he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, likely on the same day. When the news reached Normandy, William was reportedly enraged. He claimed he was the rightful king, citing a supposed promise Edward had made to him back in 1051. But William knew that a vague 15-year-old promise wasn't enough to justify a full-scale invasion. He needed something more potent, a moral and religious justification, a casus belli, and he found it in Harold's visit of 1064. William's claim was that Harold wasn't a king, but a usurper, and worse, a perjurer, an oath-breaker. The Norman narrative, likely only fully crafted after Harold had been elected king, was extremely simple and easy to understand. During his time as William's guest of honor, Harold had allegedly sworn a sacred oath, on holy relics, to support William's claim to the English throne. By accepting the crown from the council, Harold had therefore violated this sacred vow, damning his own soul and forfeiting his right to rule. This claim of a broken oath became the central pillar of the entire Norman justification for the conflict, and they documented it in one of the most brilliant and biased works of art in history, the Bayeux Tapestry. The tapestry's climax before the battle itself is the oath scene. We see Harold, looking uncomfortable, standing between two large reliquary shrines, his hands placed upon them. The Latin inscription above reads, translated into English, "Harold made an oath to Duke William." The tapestry, however, is conveniently silent on what he swore, or why. For those details, we must turn to the Norman chroniclers, men like William of Poitiers, William's personal chaplain, and William of Jumièges. Writing to legitimize their patron's new regime, they provided the full details that couldn't be fit on a piece of fabric. Later versions of the story even added a dramatic flourish of trickery. William, knowing that Harold was a man of dubious moral character, had Harold swear on 2 small caskets. Only after the oath was given did he pull back a cloth to reveal a heap of hidden sacred relics, turning a simple promise into a terrifying, soul-binding sin. Notably, this was the propaganda spread from the Norman side, even though to our modern sensibilities William comes off quite poorly in this telling. William launched a masterful diplomatic and public relations campaign aimed at the most powerful man in Christendom, Pope Alexander II. William sent an embassy to Rome, likely led by his trusted advisor and future Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc. First, they argued King Edward had promised the throne to William. Second, Harold Godwinson had usurped that throne by breaking a holy oath sworn on sacred relics. This part was very important to the church, as it would have indicated that Godwinson wouldn't have respected the authority of the clergy as King of England. Third, William promised that if he were victorious, he would reform the supposedly corrupt Anglo-Saxon church and bring it fully in line with Rome. The Pope, who had deep ties with William of Normandy, was convinced. He gave William's invasion his official blessing, and according to the Norman sources, sent a papal banner to be carried at the head of William's army. Historians have noted that the only contemporary source to even mention this holy banner is, once again, William of Poitiers. It's entirely possible the banner story, too, was an invention, created after the victory to retroactively prove that God had been on William's side all along. This brings us to the final fatal flaw in the Norman claim. First, let's assume Harold Godwinson knelt in William's court and swore on every relic in Normandy to give William the throne. Despite this, the oath was, by all legal and theological standards of the day, completely and utterly worthless. First, it was an oath made under duress. Harold was a captive. He had been shipwrecked, imprisoned, and handed over to William. Despite being framed as being a guest of honor, he couldn't leave on his own accord. Medieval canon law, the religious law that governed all of Christendom, was clear on this point. Oaths or promises extracted by force or fear had no validity. Second, and more importantly, Harold had no authority to promise the crown. He was the Earl of Wessex, not the King of England. He couldn't give away a kingdom that was not his to give. Even Edward, who had also allegedly promised the crown to William, ultimately had no such authority. The English crown wasn't a piece of personal property that could be willed away. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy was elective, and the king was chosen by the Council of Wise Men. William, a ruthless and intelligent ruler, knew this. He knew the oath was legally and theologically void, but he also knew that oath-breaker was a powerful, simple, and damning accusation. William could simply repeat this lie over and over again for propagandistic purposes. The genius of the propaganda is that it starts with the assumption that there was a valid oath, reframing the question to be whether Harold was an oath-breaker or not. In the end, history has been much more kind to Harold Godwinson than William the Conqueror was. The scholarly consensus is now uniformly in Godwinson's favor. Even if he did swear such an oath in 1064, he did it under duress, which by the standards of the time was illegal. Further yet, even if he had given the promise under his own free will, this would be the very rough equivalent of the richest man in America promising the presidency to someone. It wouldn't be his to give even if the promise was valid, since there's an elective system in place. In the end, Harold Godwinson wasn't a perjurer. He was the lawfully elected King of England, who died on a battlefield defending his country. Perhaps this is one of the reasons history remembers William of Normandy primarily by the nickname the Conqueror. We know how Harold Godwinson's story ends. October 14th, 1066. A brutal day-long battle near Hastings. An arrow fired from a Norman bow famously strikes the last Anglo-Saxon king of England in the eye. It's the image immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most famous works of art in human history. But before he was cut down, Harold Godwinson was the most powerful man in England. However, unlike most other kings of Anglo-Saxon England, comparatively little is known about his ancestry. While his Norman enemies would portray him as coming from a long line of peasants in an effort to delegitimize him, the truth is actually much more fascinating. This isn't an academic debate about genealogy, but rather the virtually untold story about how Harold was likely the descendant of a noble turned treacherous pirate. Born around 1022, he was the son of Earl Godwin, the formidable Earl of Wessex. This gave him a significant leg up in life, and he took advantage of every opportunity he was given. Harold's own career was stellar. He was made Earl of East Anglia in 1045, and when his father died in 1053, Harold succeeded him as Earl of Wessex. This made him the second most powerful man in the kingdom, only second to the king himself. His power was so great that he was the king's own brother-in-law. His sister Edith was married to King Edward the Confessor. When Edward died childless on January 5th, 1066, the Witenagemot, the Council of England's wise men, convened and chose Harold to succeed him. He was crowned the very next day, probably in Westminster Abbey. His reign was destined to be short, just 9 months and 9 days. In that time, he faced 2 massive invasions. He performed a miracle by marching his army north to annihilate a Viking invasion led by Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But just days later, he was forced to march his exhausted army 300 miles south to confront William of Normandy, who had landed in Sussex. William's claim to the throne was based on a supposed promise from King Edward, and more importantly, a sacred oath he claimed Harold had sworn to him years earlier. To justify his invasion, William's chroniclers had to paint Harold as a perjurer, a usurper, and most importantly, an oath-breaker. When facing off against one of the most powerful men in Europe, the easiest way to do that was to attack his family's legitimacy. We can't fully understand Harold without first understanding his father, Godwin. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was the true kingmaker of his generation. He was the most powerful political operator in England, a man who built a dynasty from the ground up. His rise began under the Danish king Canute the Great, who conquered England in 1016. Godwin, an Anglo-Saxon, proved himself a loyal and capable lieutenant to the new Danish king. Canute rewarded him, making him Earl of Wessex around 1018. Godwin became a close advisor and cemented his power by navigating the chaotic successions after Canute's death. By 1042, he played a key role in placing King Edward the Confessor on the throne. He then married his daughter Edith to Edward in 1045, placing the Godwin family at the very heart of royal power. He also secured earldoms for his many sons, including Harold. Godwin's power became so total that King Edward, who was half Norman and had spent decades in exile in Normandy, grew to resent him. King Edward began to scheme against these powerful lords, failing to fully account for the influence they held on the continent as well. In 1051, after Godwin refused a direct royal order to punish the men of Dover for a brawl with a Norman lord, the king found his chance and exiled the entire Godwin family. The family made their way to Flanders, where they quickly consolidated their position and prepared their next steps. It was during this brief period that Edward likely first promised the throne to William of Normandy. But Godwin wasn't finished. In 1052, he and Harold assembled a fleet and returned to England by force. Their popular support was so overwhelming that a defenseless King Edward was forced to back down and restore the Godwins to all their lands and titles. It was a coup, a humiliation for the king that proved where the real power in England lay. When Godwin died suddenly in 1053, Harold inherited this vast, unrivaled power. While Edward was officially the most powerful man in England, Harold played the role of the second adeptly. So where did this family, powerful enough to defy a king, come from? This is where the mystery and the propaganda truly begins. The first theory, popular with Norman chroniclers and later saga writers, is that Godwin, Harold's father, was an absolute nobody. 12th century stories claimed he was the son of a shepherd, a rustic who stumbled into greatness. This tale served the Norman narrative perfectly, painting Harold's family as low-born upstarts. But as modern historians have argued, it's highly improbable that Canute, a new conqueror, would elevate a random peasant to the most powerful earldom in England. Further, this narrative also presented the existence of Harold Godwinson on the English throne as an inversion of the natural order. Harold and his family had defied the will of God by seizing power. To the noble Norman audience, it made sense that a low-born person would break an oath. At the other extreme is a fringe theory, first proposed in 1913 by Alfred Anscombe, a British historian. This theory suggests the Godwins were, in fact, descended from the old Anglo-Saxon royal line of Wessex, specifically from King Ethelred I, the older brother of Alfred the Great. The argument is based on a complicated analysis of land charters in Sussex. However, it's now rejected by all serious historians. The reasoning for this is quite simple. If Harold had a drop of this royal blood, he surely would have used it to legitimize his claim in 1066. The fact that he didn't is telling. The historical consensus, the theory that makes the most sense, lies in the middle. Harold's grandfather was almost certainly a man named Wulfnoth Sild. The title Sild is key. It's an Old English term for a man of high rank, a noble, or a warrior. If this theory is correct, Harold's grandfather was a thane, a member of the landed aristocracy. But Wulfnoth had a dark past that made any association with him potentially problematic. In 1009, During the failing reign of King Ethelred the Unready, Wulfnoth was at a great assembly of the English fleet when he was accused of treason by a rival noble. We don't know what he was accused of, but Wulfnoth fled and turned traitor, and from there things get so much worse. He took 20 ships, resorted to piracy, and began raiding the southern coast of England, which sounds bad enough on its own. When a royal fleet of 80 ships was sent after him, a storm drove the royal fleet ashore, and Wulfnoth moved in to burn the fleet. He was, in essence, a traitor of the highest order that deliberately destroyed England's wooden wall that protected it from the continent. Wulfnoth died in disgrace, his lands and titles likely confiscated. This is the real key to the House of Godwin. Harold's father, Godwin, wasn't a peasant. He was something even worse. He was the son of a disgraced aristocrat who had literally destroyed England's navy. Godwin was thus the perfect man for a new conqueror like Canute to employ. He was talented, ambitious, and experienced with local politics, but with absolutely no loyalty whatsoever to the old English regime that had ruined his father. If Harold's paternal line was controversial, his maternal line was impeccable. Godwin's other masterstroke was his marriage to Gytha Thorkel's daughter, a high-status Danish noblewoman. This marriage, which happened around 1019, was a political alliance that cemented Godwin's place in Canute's new Anglo-Danish world. In fact, Harold Godwinson's mother was the sister-in-law of Canute's sister. It was an indirect, though extremely prestigious and undeniable link to the Danish royal house that had ruled England just a generation earlier. Harold Godwinson wasn't descended from shepherds as the Normans claimed, nor was he a long-lost royal prince. His rise to power was built through laws of succession that the conquering Normans would make impossible. His claim to the throne in 1066 didn't come from an ancient, unbroken line of kings. It came from his personal proven abilities, his family's decades of political dominance, and his ability to appeal to the counsel of wise men in a time of crisis. In fact, had Harold Godwinson only faced one massive invasion, he may have been the hero the realm needed. Unfortunately for Harold, he was dealt one of the worst hands a new king could possibly face, and he's now most remembered for overseeing the fall of the Anglo-Saxon order. The year is 1189. The scene is a frantic retreat in northern France. The aging King Henry II, ruler of the vast Angevin Empire, is fleeing for his life. His domain, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, is crumbling, and the man chasing him down, spearheading the rebellion, is his own son, Richard, the man history would come to call the Lionheart. Henry's loyal rearguard is commanded by a single knight, a man in his 40s named William Marshall. As the king escapes, Marshall turns his horse to face the pursuit. He's in full battle kit, a wall of steel and wood. Suddenly, one man outpaces the rest, charging Marshall directly. It's Richard. But in his haste to keep his weight down and his speed up, Richard has left most of his armor behind. He's wearing a light helmet and doublet, carrying only a sword. This is the moment. Marshall, arguably the greatest knight in European history, has the heir to the throne, his master's enemy, at the point of his lance. He could end the rebellion and Richard's life in a single thrust. Richard, recognizing his peril, reportedly shouted out, pleading for his life and claiming he was unarmed. Marshall's reply was a masterstroke of defiance and political calculation. He declared that he wouldn't be the one to strike down Richard, and that the devil himself could have that honor. But he didn't just spare him, he made a point. Marshall drove his lance not into the prince, but into Richard's horse. In doing so, he unhorsed the future king of England, battering his ego but leaving Richard mostly unharmed. He had stopped the pursuit, humiliated the prince, and proven, in one devastating moment, who the superior knight truly was. Days later, King Henry II died. William Marshal was suddenly the subject of a new king, a man he had just bested and shamed. But Richard, in a stunning act of political savvy, didn't punish Marshal. He rewarded him. He granted the landless knight the hand of Isabel de Clare, the richest heiress in the kingdom, making Marshal, at 43, one of the wealthiest barons in the Angevin Empire overnight. Richard didn't just see a man who had defeated him. He saw a man whose loyalty to his old failing king was so unshakable that he would face down the Lionheart himself. That was a loyalty Richard needed to co-opt, not destroy. This single event captures the essence of William Marshal, the man eulogized by the Archbishop of Canterbury as the greatest knight that ever lived. William was born around 1146, the fourth son of a minor noble, John Marshal. As a younger son of minor nobility, he was a nobody. He had no claim to land, title, or wealth. His only currency would be his skill and his reputation. He learned this hard lesson during the civil strife known as the Anarchy. His father, a well-known political turncoat, gave young William, then just 5 or 6 years old, to King Stephen as a hostage to secure a truce. John Marshal immediately broke the truce, prioritizing his own military advantage over his son's life. An enraged King Stephen threatened to have William eliminated. When John was told of his son's fate, he gave a reply that has echoed through history. He didn't care. He claimed he still had the, quote, hammer and the anvil with which to forge more and better sons. I'll let that one sink in for a quick second. Young William was disposable to his own father. He was saved only by the mercy of the king. King Stephen, looking at the innocent boy, found he couldn't bring himself to actually follow through on his threats. His counselors likely advised him against it as well, since the taboo on committing such an act was obviously extreme and there was nothing to be gained regardless. This experience is the psychological key to William Marshal's life. His father represented chaos, betrayal, and disloyalty. The crown, in the person of King Stephen, represented order and mercy. Marshal's entire career can be seen as a lifelong quest to be the antithesis of his father. He would be a man whose vow was unbreakable and whose loyalty to the institution of the monarchy was absolute. Notably, this story comes from a biography that was commissioned by William's own son, not from a medieval chronicler. While some historians believe the story is simply too perfect to be believed, whether true or not, this is how William Marshal perceived himself. He was intentionally breaking off from his dishonorable roots, forging a new family legacy in the process. With no inheritance, William was packed off to Normandy to train as a knight. He entered the 12th century tournament circuit, which wasn't the polite one-on-one jousting we imagine. It was the mêlée, a massive, chaotic, team-based mock battle fought across miles of open countryside. Despite the fact that there was no prize money, William treated it as a profitable business. A knight made his fortune by capturing opponents and ransoming them, their horses, and their armor back to them. William Marshal became the undisputed superstar of this sport. He was a cunning strategist, known for tactics like holding his team back until the others were exhausted, then riding in to capture the richest prizes. His biography claims that over his career, he defeated or captured over 500 knights, a figure that, true or not, functions more like a profit ledger than anything. This success got him his first big break. He was appointed as the personal tutor-in-arms to Henry the Young King, the son of Henry II. Marshal was now at the center of the royal court, but it was a dangerous place. In 1181, rivals, likely jealous of this landless upstart's success, accused him of a terrible crime, conducting an affair with the young king's wife. He fell from grace, but a year later, the young king accepted his innocence and recalled him. When the young king perished from dysentery in 1183, he made Marshal promise to take his crusader's cross to the Holy Land in his place. There was, of course, no one to ensure that William Marshal actually fulfilled this promise, but from what you know about him so far, I bet you can guess what happened next. Marshal fulfilled the vow, spending 2 years abroad. This was a masterstroke of personal branding. He returned to Europe known not just as its greatest fighter, but as its most loyal, a man who kept his oath to his master, even beyond the grave. Marshal's unwavering loyalty would be tested to its absolute limit by his service to King John. After serving Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, Marshal found himself bound to a king who was cruel, incompetent, and mistrusted by all. As the barons of England began to revolt against John's tyrannical taxes and disastrous military failures, Marshal faced a crisis. He was one of the very few great earls to remain loyal to the king. This loyalty was not born of affection. He and John had major differences. At one point, King John, in a classic fit of paranoia, even demanded Marshal's own sons as hostages to ensure his good behavior, a bitter echo of William's own childhood. Yet, William Marshal never wavered. His loyalty wasn't to John the man. It was to the institution of the crown. He had seen the chaos of the anarchy and believed a bad king was better than no king. He saw the barons as oath-breakers inviting something even worse. He instead cast himself as a mediator. He was a principal advisor, alongside the Knights Templar, who counseled John to come to the negotiating table at Runnymede in 1215. He was instrumental in the sealing of the Magna Carta, not as a rebel, but as a conservative trying to save the kingdom from itself. His commitment was to the Charter as a tool of peace. This is proven by his later actions. When John died in 1216, having already broken his promises, he trusted William Marshal on his deathbed with the most important task of all. In a moment of clarity, King John instructed William Marshal to protect his 9-year-old son and heir, Henry III, and save the kingdom. William Marshal, now 70 years old, was appointed Regent of England and set about bringing about order. This was a seemingly impossible task. King John was dead, the treasury was empty due to his squandering. To compound matters, Prince Louis of France had been invited to invade by rebellious barons and controlled more than half of England, including London. The Plantagenet dynasty was on the brink of extinction, but William Marshal was, after all, a man who took his oaths seriously. In 1217, the French and rebel barons were besieging Lincoln Castle, which was being held by a loyal and elderly noblewoman, Nicola de la Haye. Marshal, reverting to his roots as a tournament champion, decided to risk everything on a single high-stakes assault. He mustered the royalist forces and, in true knightly fashion, prepared for battle. His pre-battle speech, recorded in his biography, is a masterpiece of leadership. He transformed a messy civil conflict into a holy crusade. He told his knights they weren't just fighting for land or a boy king. They were fighting to defend their homes, their children, and the church. He reminded them that their enemies were excommunicated by the Pope, and that if they died in this battle, they would gain full redemption for their sins. He wasn't just offering them victory, he was offering them absolution. William Marshal was, in essence, giving the speech of a crusader king to his troops. Despite being 70 years old, William Marshal put on his helmet and led the charge himself. The Royalist army, a portion of which had snuck into the city through a side gate, took the French completely by surprise. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the battle was a total, crushing victory for Marshal and his royalist forces. This battle broke the rebellion, and the excommunicated French prince was forced to abandon his claims to England once and for all. But Marshal's genius wasn't just in his force of arms or in his personal bravery, it was in winning the peace. Instead of eliminating the captured rebels, he wisely granted them amnesty, bringing them back into the fold. He knew the kingdom was fractured and needed healing, not more revenge. His duty was finally done. He had saved the kingdom, secured the throne for Henry III, and reissued the Magna Carta, entrenching it as the law of the land. William Marshal, the fourth son who started with nothing, had become the protector and savior of England. He had bent history to his will through his own personality, becoming one of the most powerful people in medieval Europe. In 1219, feeling his death was near, he retired to his estates. He had one last vow to fulfill, one he had made decades before, perhaps in the Holy Land. He summoned his loyal retainer and had him retrieve a simple silk shroud he had kept in storage his entire life. He then took the vows of a Knight Templar. This was his final perfect act of a true knight. By dying as a warrior monk, he was sanctifying his entire career, reconciling his worldly deeds with the demands of his faith. He died not as a powerful earl, but as a brother of the Templar Order, and was buried in their Temple Church in London, where his effigy lies to this day. William Marshal's story is a reminder that sometimes even the most fantastic stories are true, and some individual people can bend the entire arc of history. If William Marshal had accomplished the equivalent of these deeds in the heroic age of Greece, for instance, most historians would think he was simply a legendary figure. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Hitting that notification bell actually increases the chances my new videos will pop up on your homepage, more so than subscribing even. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. For the fishermen of 12th century Orford, England, a small but vital port on the Suffolk coast, the ocean was their livelihood. But it was also a churning, mysterious void. Sometime around the year 1167, a group of these fishermen, trawling off the shifting shingle of Orford Ness, felt their nets grow unusually heavy. They strained, anticipating a great haul. But what they pulled from the depths was not a bounty of fish. It was what was described as a wild man. The account, recorded by a contemporary chronicler, describes the fisherman's shock and awe. He was covered in hair, particularly on his chest, and was distinguished by a long, shaggy beard. This was no seal or walrus. It was something disturbingly human. Terrified and bewildered, the fishermen didn't know what to do. They brought their fantastic catch to the highest authority in the town, Bartholomew de Glanville, the Castellan of Orford Castle. The Castellan, upon seeing the so-called creature, was shocked and had no idea what exactly he was laying his eyes upon. So he did the natural thing and locked the wild man up in the keep. The wild man was held for 6 months in the castle. His behavior, meticulously recorded by the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, only deepened the mystery. He was utterly silent. His only communication came in the form of grunting. He ate a lot, but with a bizarre, specific ritual. He preferred his food raw. He would take fresh fish, press them tightly between his hands to wring out every drop of moisture, and only then would he eat the dry flesh. This detail, so strange and particular, feels less like a monster trope and more like a genuine, baffled observation. He also followed a natural rhythm, seeking his bed at sunset and remaining there until sunrise. The Castellan and his men, desperate to categorize their prisoner, subjected him to the two great tests of the 12th century, intended to prove humanity or sentience. After all, these people lived in a time when it was widely accepted and believed that dog-headed men were real, and craved salvation for their sins just as much as a human. The first was for logos, or reason, which was proven by speech. Despite all their efforts, he remained mute. The second test was for a soul. They took him to church to see if he would recognize the sacred. The experiment was a horrifying failure. The alleged creature showed no sign of any form of belief, failing to kneel or bow his head. He was, in their eyes, an unclassifiable object, a being with the shape of a man, but with neither speech nor soul. The story would be lost to history if not for its recorder. Ralph of Coggeshall, the man who wrote the account in his Chronicon Anglicanum around 1200, wasn't a writer of fantasy. He was the abbot of Coggeshall Abbey, a Cistercian monk, and a serious chronicler of politics and church affairs. But like many medieval historians, Ralph's worldview included marvels and wonders, as well as routine miraculous occurrences. He is the same source who recorded the equally strange tale of the Green Children of Woolpit, which I've discussed before. To Ralph, these events weren't fake. They were factual reports from the fringes of God's creation, and it was his duty to record them accurately. The 12th century mind didn't see the world as we do. The sea was a place of profound mystery, and maps like the Mappa Mundi depicted mermaids alongside fish. So, what did the fishermen really catch? Historians today are, of course, skeptical of mermen, but they generally agree that something very unusual happened at Orford. The detailed report, naming the specific castellan, makes it unlikely to be a total fabrication. The theories are all, in their own way, tragic, considering the fate of the wild man. It's possible he was a feral human, an outcast living wild. He may also have been suffering from a severe mental illness. But perhaps the most compelling and plausible theory is that he was a traumatized foreigner. He could have been a sailor, perhaps Flemish or Spanish, shipwrecked and suffering from profound trauma. Some have even suggested he may have been from North Africa, given his lack of reverence for the church environment. His lack of reaction in the church would be perfectly understandable for a man in shock, or for someone who wasn't a Christian. His grunts may have been a language his captors simply didn't recognize. His feral state could be explained by starvation and exposure, and his preference for raw fish might be the desperate habit of a survivor. The most common modern dismissal, that he was a misidentified animal like a seal or a walrus, crumbles under scrutiny. The Suffolk coast, particularly Orford Ness, is now a major colony for gray seals. But the Chronicle is insistent on his humanoid form, claiming that the wild man in essence looked totally human. If it were a seal or a walrus, it's highly unlikely that these maritime people would have been fooled by the wild man. Further, a seal or a walrus face doesn't look human, and there's a perfect animal the people could have described it as. They could have said that he had a face that resembled a dog, and in the case of a seal, it even barks. Perhaps most damningly for this outright dismissal, the wild man was held captive for 6 months. It is simply not credible that a royal castellan, his guards, and the entire town would mistake a seal or a walrus for a man at close range for half a year. The story of the wild man is almost certainly a human tragedy, misunderstood through a medieval lens. The story's ending is as strange as its beginning. The castellan, perhaps growing weary of his silent prisoner, eventually allowed him to be taken to the harbor for a swim. But he took precautions, penning the man in the water with a number of strong nets. The wild man immediately dove under the nets and resurfaced on the other side. His captors thought this was an act of mockery, but they were wrong. The wild man swam under the net and returned back to his captors. It was a brilliant, calculated move, showing that this so-called unthinking wild man likely had the ability to strategize. He remained with his captors for 2 more months. His test escape and voluntary return had lulled his guards into complacency. Then 2 months later, after fooling everyone into thinking he was a good prisoner, he simply left the keep and fled back into the sea, never to be seen again. In a 10th century Anglo-Saxon settlement on the outskirts of Ely, Cambridgeshire, archaeologists made a discovery that stops us in our tracks. In the ditches and pits, they found the discarded bones of cattle and cats, unceremoniously dumped there like household trash. But nearby, they found something else entirely. They uncovered the remains of roughly 20 dogs, each one carefully and individually buried. This stark difference in treatment, this deliberate act of care and death, poses a fascinating question. What was the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and animals that they may have seen as their pets? It's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, mostly because our modern world has drawn a sharp line between pet and utility. Today we are largely detached from the livestock that feeds us, allowing us to designate other animals purely for companionship. But in Anglo-Saxon England, that line was almost non-existent. For most people, humans and animals lived in close daily proximity. An animal's survival, and by extension its owners, depended on its function. Historians have tried to create checklists to identify pets in the past, animals that were named, kept indoors, and not eaten. But this modern definition fails in the medieval world. A lord's favorite warhorse or a hunter's best hound would have been named, cherished, and been the object of intense attachment. Yet despite all the love for these animals, they were still fundamentally utility creatures. This is why we must reject the idea that utility and affection are opposites. In the Anglo-Saxon world, they were often deeply intertwined. An animal's usefulness, its skill as a hunter, its loyalty as a guard, was often the very thing that earned it a place by the fire, and in turn, a place in its owner's heart. When it comes to dogs, the evidence for a special bond is overwhelming, and it starts with those burials at Ely. That careful individual burial is an action that speaks of an emotional, non-economic relationship. This isn't an isolated case. Dog burials are a known feature of the period, particularly in pre-Christian graves, where dogs were sometimes included to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Even after widespread conversion to Christianity, the sentiment that animals need special burials survived. Beyond burials, the bones themselves tell stories of compassion. Archaeologists have found canine skeletons from the period that show evidence of healed fractures or chronic painful diseases like arthritis. In purely practical terms, a dog with a broken leg is quote-unquote a drain on the household it inhabits. It can't herd, hunt, or guard. The fact that these animals were clearly fed, protected, and allowed to heal shows a compassionate, non-utilitarian investment of resources. While some argue this was to preserve their investment, it's hard to see this as anything other than true care for the animal. The cat's story is even more complex. Though introduced to Britain by the Iron Age or Roman period, their bones are far less common in the archaeological record than those of dogs. Their primary and vital function was as mousers, protecting the precious grain stores that were the lifeblood of a settlement, especially in growing towns. This makes the cat the ultimate contextual animal, as its role could shift dramatically based on its situation. For some, it was a biological pest control officer. For others, the cat may have been some sort of part-time companion. Disturbingly, the cat was also a commodity. At some urban sites, cat bones have been found with skinning marks, clear evidence of a commercial fur trade. It's hard to imagine a cat in that context was seen as a pet. However, there is good evidence that some cats were indeed companions valued beyond their ability to catch mice. If one simply wanted a cat to be a primo mouser, it would make sense not to feed the cat and just let it hunt down rodents. However, there is significant evidence of cats being actively fed by humans, supported by isotopic analyses, which show they consumed fish from the sea. Notably, the practice of clergy keeping cats must have been common, as church officials later spent centuries trying to ban monks and nuns from keeping them. If you're wondering, these efforts were largely unsuccessful. There was one animal, however, that was exclusively reserved for the elite: the hawk. Falconry was perhaps the most popular and high-status sport of the aristocracy. Owning a trained raptor was an expensive and public status symbol. It was part of what scholars call an ideology of predation, where the warrior elite defined themselves by their mastery over other powerful predators. The archaeology of the elite backs this up. Raptor bones are found almost exclusively at high-status rural and ecclesiastical sites. But was this magnificent creature just a tool, a living weapon? The Old English poem known as the Battle of Maldon provides a stunningly clear answer. As the battle is about to begin, a young Anglo-Saxon warrior prepares for the fight. In a gesture of ultimate commitment, he lets his hawk fly from his hand to the safety of the woods, a sign that he will not be distracted from his duty. The poet describes the bird as his beloved hawk, and the poet uses it casually, without stopping to explain why a warrior would love his bird. This suggests the relationship was common and understood by the audience. The warrior wanted his beloved animal to be safe because he loved it. Finally, we have one of the most powerful lines of evidence: the law. Anglo-Saxon law, such as the codes of King Alfred, was built around a system of compensation. Everything and everyone had a legally defined monetary value. A person's life price was their weregild, or man payment. Animals were legally property, and the laws set specific fines for stealing or injuring them. While we don't have a complete Anglo-Saxon pet law, a contemporary 10th century Welsh law from a king who was an ally of the English gives us a detailed snapshot. A house dog was valued at 4 pence, same as a cat, but the cat was only valued that way if it could hunt mice. The dog had no such restriction placed on it. This suggests that there was an inherent companionship value seen in dogs that perhaps wasn't seen in cats at that time. Now compare that to the elite animals. A trained royal hunting dog was valued at 240 pence. This makes perfect sense. It's a highly skilled, valuable working animal that produced value for its owner. To produce such a dog took a significant amount of investment in training. But here's the most shocking and illuminating detail of all. A royal lapdog was valued at the exact same price, 240 pence. This is hard economic proof written into law. It tells us that pure companionship had a significant value, equal to that of a working dog. This suggests that dogs were viewed as pets, both by the nobility and by the common people. Notably, no such distinctions were made for royal cats, again reinforcing the idea that cats may have been viewed less as pets than dogs. Also, I do have to reiterate that these were Welsh laws, but that the minor king who implemented them was under Anglo-Saxon overlordship. Some scholars believe that it's likely that the laws on animals were essentially copy and pasted from the Anglo-Saxons, though of course this hasn't been proven as yet. One final piece of evidence is that the Anglo-Saxons simply had no unique word for the concept of a pet. The concept as we understand it today wasn't fully solidified into the English language until the 17th century. Only then was it fully understood that a pet is a creature you love, for no reason other than the fact that it exists. Based on the evidence at present, the Anglo-Saxons didn't quite have pets in the way we understand the term. Despite this, though, the evidence for genuine affection is undeniable. The Anglo-Saxons of all classes lived and worked alongside their animals every single day. Sometimes these animals were relegated to the background, like the cat, and sometimes they were the most prized possession of a king, like a graceful hawk. The Anglo-Saxons may not have had a word for pet, but they definitely had the fundamental basics of the concept. It's a scene of ancient legalistic theater. Whenever a new bishop of Durham assumes office, he's met at Croft Bridge, the entry point to his diocese over the River Tees. This is a political ceremony, a fossilized feudal contract. The Lord of Sockburn, or in modern times the Mayor of Darlington, steps forward holding a magnificent, ancient sword. This is the Conyers Falchion. The holder presents the blade and recites the words of tenure, a speech that has echoed for centuries. He declares that this is the very falchion the champion Conyers used to slay a terrible, quote, worm, dragon, or fiery serpent that was devouring, quote, man, woman, and child. The manor, he explains, was granted to the Conyers family to be held by this very tenure. The bishop is the stand-in for this family, which has long faded into the pages of history. The new bishop, acknowledging his authority as the region's temporal and spiritual ruler, takes the sword and immediately returns it. This ritual, first recorded as a token of land tenure in 1396, is a stunning piece of living history. It's built on a fantastic premise that a noble family's vast estate was a finder's fee for literally slaying a dragon called the Sockburn Worm in 1063. The earliest detailed accounts we have, preserved in 17th century manuscripts, explain the background of this mighty beast. The creature was a specific type of two-legged winged dragon. It terrorized the lands of Sockburn, a village nestled in a tight loop of the River Tees. The beast's breath was so lethally toxic, and its scent so strong, that it would disable people and then consume them. Into this chaos stepped the hero, Sir John Conyers. He prepared for the battle not just as a warrior, but as a devout champion. Sir John rode to the local church in full armor and made a solemn vow in exchange for the power to defeat the dragon. He offered up his only son to the Holy Spirit, stating that if he failed to protect the people, his heir could be taken from him freely. It was a bit of an unconventional offering, but if the legend is to be believed, this was just the trick to solve the dragon problem. He then confronted the wyvern, and with his trusty falchion, slew the beast. The legend even gives his victory a physical marker, claiming he buried the monster's remains under a large boulder on the peninsula, a site still known today as the Grey Stone. For this great deed, the reigning king rewarded Sir John with the manor of Sockburn, to be held by his family forever. His son, too, was presumably grateful, as Sir John had offered him up as a bargaining chip if he didn't succeed. This is a powerful origin story, but the problem is, the Conyers Falchion is a real sword. It's safeguarded in the Durham Cathedral treasury and can be viewed today. It's a magnificent and rare specimen of a medieval cleaver falchion, a single-edged curved sword. It's 3 feet long, weighs less than 3 pounds, and possesses a bronze pommel and crossguard with an ashwood grip. The pommel itself is the key. It's decorated with specific heraldic symbols, the 3 lions of England on one side and a black eagle on the other. This combination is a significant blow to the legend's timeline. The 3 lions motif wasn't even used in the English royal arms until 1154, and this specific set of arms is firmly dated by experts to the reign of King Henry III, or shortly after. The sword was forged, at the earliest, around 1270. The legend, however, emphatically dates the slaying to 1063, just before the Norman conquest. The weapon supposedly used to slay the dragon was actually made 200 years after the supposed event. This 200-year gap isn't a mistake, it's the entire point. It reveals the legend as a brilliant and masterful piece of political propaganda. The Conyers family were, in fact, Normans. They arrived in England with William the Conqueror and were granted their lands by the new regime. The legend, likely created in the 13th century to coincide with the forging of their new ceremonial sword, was a piece of political spin. By inventing a heroic ancestor and deliberately backdating his deed to 1063, they retroactively changed their own history. They were no longer foreign invaders who had been given the land. They were now local heroes who had earned the land by defending the native population. Further, they had done so before the Normans even arrived, indicating how entrenched they viewed themselves with the local populace. They didn't invent the story from nothing. The northeast of England is worm country, with a plethora of similar legends. The most popular scholarly theory suggests the worm, a word from the Old Norse term ormir, meaning serpent, was potentially a lingering folk memory of Viking raiders. The Vikings' dragon-proud longships would have seemed like monsters as they raided up the River Tees, attacking religious centers just like the one at Sockburn. The 13th century Conyers simply co-opted this local fear, mixed it with the popular Christian archetype of a St. George-like dragon slayer, and cast their ancestor as the hero. In this way, they transformed their own history into something local and familiar, much more in line with the subjects they governed day to day. Though its origins were political, an attempt to enhance the reputation of a minor noble family, the legend's cultural power proved far more potent. The haunting landscape of Sockburn, with its ruined church and manor, became a pilgrimage site for romantic poets. But the worm's greatest legacy was secured by a child. In the mid-19th century, the rector at Croft-on-Tees was the father of a boy named Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. That boy, better known by his pen name Lewis Carroll, grew up in the rectory, which overlooked the very bridge where the Conyers Falchion was presented. He had been steeped in the local tale of the man who slew a fiery flying serpent with a special sword. It's almost certain that this childhood story of the Sockburn worm was the direct inspiration for his nonsense masterpiece, Jabberwocky. The ancient Conyers Falchion was reborn in Carroll's imagination as the one, the only Vorpal blade. In the end, the truth of the Sockburn worm, then, is more fascinating than any myth. It's June 5th, 754. On the bank of a river near Dockham, in what's now the Netherlands, an old man is waiting. He's 79, far from his native home in Wessex, England. His name is Winfrith, but the Pope renamed him Boniface, the doer of good. He's a missionary, an archbishop, and the most famous Englishman in Europe. He's here to confirm a group of new converts to Christianity. But the converts don't arrive. Instead, a band of pagan raiders bursts into the camp, brandishing axes and spears. Boniface's retinue tries to defend him, but he calmly forbids it, and the entire group is martyred. Why did an elite, elderly Anglo-Saxon churchman, who had already successfully organized the entire church in Germany, risk and lose his life on the dangerous pagan frontier? The answer isn't just about faith, it's about family. Boniface and the Anglo-Saxons he represented were convinced that the pagan Frisians and Saxons living on the continent were their kin. For them, making sure these people were brought into the Christian fold was of utmost importance. To explore this powerful sense of kinship, we have to go back to the man who essentially wrote the Anglo-Saxon origin story, the Venerable Bede. Writing from his monastery in Northumbria around 731, Bede completed his masterpiece, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This book's very title reveals its purpose. Before Bede, there really wasn't a single English people. There were Mercians, Northumbrians, West Saxons, and others, and they often quarreled with one another. Bede's goal was to tell the story of how a single English church had united them, and to do that, he first had to argue they were a single English people. His method was the Adventus Saxonum, or the arrival of the Saxons. He gave them a clean three-part origin. The settlers came from three specific, powerful Germanic tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. He even pointed to their homelands, with the Saxons coming from a place he called Antiqui Saxones, or Old Saxony. This narrative was a rhetorical masterstroke. It papered over the messy insular divisions by giving all the kingdoms a shared, noble, and divinely guided migration heritage. The academic consensus for a long time leaned toward this being a neat fiction invented by Bede. Archaeologists pointed out that the 5th century migration was far messier than Bede's three tribes. The material culture shows a blending of Frisians, Franks, and other groups, as well as the three foundational groups proposed. Some historians even argued for a minimalist migration, where just a small warrior elite took over and imposed their language on the native Britons. If that were true, the idea of a deep kinship with the continental Saxons would virtually be a pure invention. Then, in 2022, a landmark genetic study published in Nature changed everything. By analyzing hundreds of ancient DNA samples, researchers found large-scale substantial migration across the North Sea. They discovered that individuals from early medieval Eastern England derived up to 76% of their ancestry from continental Northern Europe. In fact, they specifically came from the regions of modern Germany and Denmark. Bede, it turns out, wasn't inventing a history. He was simply recording a massive demographic event that completely changed the face of England in a relatively short period of time. The folk memory of a continental homeland was real because, for most Anglo-Saxons, their great-grandparents had actually come from there. This bond wasn't just genetic, it was audible to anyone at the time. Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, and Old Saxon, the language of the continent, were intelligible to one another. An English missionary could arrive in Saxony and be understood. They also shared a common and still recent pagan past. When Anglo-Saxons called Wednesday Woden's Day, the Old Saxons on the continent could instantly know exactly what they meant. But just because the Anglo-Saxons kept some vestiges of their pagan past didn't mean they didn't fully adopt Christianity. The idea that their distant cousins were still caught up in pagan beliefs and practices was cause for extreme concern. This combination of a new, fervent Christianity and the old, undeniable ties of blood and language created a sense of an extremely urgent responsibility. The Anglo-Saxons, having been Christianized, saw themselves as a chosen people, but they were a chosen people with a family still in the dark. Boniface's letters, which survive to this day, are the proof. When he wrote back to England for support, he didn't hold back. He masterfully activated the rhetoric of kinship, reminding the English that the continental Saxons were, quote, of the lineage and stock of the English. In one famous letter, he pleaded for prayers for his mission to the Old Saxons, arguing that they were of one blood and one bone with the English. This was a visceral, familial appeal, but perhaps most tellingly, the communications refer to the pagan Saxons as, quote, our people. This powerful shared Saxon identity, so potent in the 8th century, was about to be shattered. The two branches of the Saxon family were hammered into two entirely different fates by two different external forces. On the continent, the old Saxons' paganism was brutally extinguished by the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne. From 772 to 804, he waged a brutal 32-year campaign of conquest and terror that culminated in his elimination of the old Saxon elite. The survivors were then forcibly Christianized and absorbed into the Carolingian Empire. At the very same time, the Anglo-Saxons in England faced their existential threat: the pagan Vikings. This new, terrifying threat served to unite the Anglo-Saxon identity. In response to the Norse, King Alfred the Great politically activated the very identity Bede had written about. He rallied the English people under the banner of their kin, but this understanding of who was or was not a relative was different. Their old Saxon cousins on the continent were forgotten, and the meaning was restricted to Anglo-Saxon people living in Britain. So, was the Anglo-Saxon kinship with the old Saxons a genuine memory or a useful fiction? The scholarly consensus today is that it was, unequivocally, both. It was a genuine folk memory, not an invented tradition. It was rooted in the proven, large-scale migration of a people, and reinforced by the daily, lived reality of a language they could still understand. But a memory, on its own, is just a story. It becomes powerful when it's activated. This raw material of kinship was seized by clerical elites with world-changing ambitions. Bede activated it for internal unification, to forge the earliest concept of what it meant to be English. Boniface activated it for external mobilization, a mission to the world to save his heathen cousins across the sea. For Boniface, that memory was a moral imperative so profound that it led him to that riverbank in Frisia, where he proved that an idea of family is worth the ultimate sacrifice. Outside the Grand Palace of Westminster, the heart of British governance, stands an imposing bronze statue. A crowned king, sword held high, sits astride a powerful war horse. It's a potent symbol of English monarchy, of martial valor, and of national pride. The man immortalized is King Richard I, known to history as Coeur de Lion, the Lion Heart. Yet, this quintessential image of an English hero conceals a startling paradox. During a 10-year reign from 1189 to 1199, this legendary king spent, by most historical estimates, a grand total of 6 months on English soil. How did a man so physically detached from England become one of its most enduring national symbols? It's a story of identity, empire, and continental ambition. To understand why Richard was an absentee king, we must first accept that he was never truly an English king to begin with. Richard was born in Oxford in September 1157, a fact that ties him geographically to England from his first breath. But this detail is misleading, and his world was thoroughly and unalterably French. His parents were Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England, and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Both were of French birth and culture. Neither spoke English, and the language of their court was French. While Richard spent his earliest years in England with an English wet nurse named Hodierna, this interlude was brief. At the age of 7, he was taken to the continent, and it was there, in the sun-drenched lands of southern France, that his identity was forged. The defining relationship of Richard's life wasn't with his powerful but often adversarial father, but with his mother, Eleanor. Richard was her favorite son, the child who most resembled her in temperament and spirit. From 1168, Eleanor took up residence in her ancestral Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory that was hers by right. She kept Richard by her side, deliberately grooming him to be her heir and the future ruler of this fiercely independent land. At just 14, he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine. He grew up immersed in the sophisticated culture of southern France, a world of chivalric knights, courtly love, and troubadours. This was arguably the most stereotypically high medieval location imaginable, and it couldn't have been more different from England. He wasn't just a consumer of this pinnacle of high medieval culture, he was a participant, composing his own poetry and songs in French and the local dialect. Aquitaine wasn't just a territory he was assigned to govern. By all accounts, he considered it his true home. To grasp Richard's priorities, one must understand the political entity he was born to rule. It wasn't a unified nation-state in the modern sense. Historians call it the Angevin Empire, a sprawling collection of territories held together not by a common identity, but by personal allegiance to a single family, the Plantagenets. This quote-unquote empire stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England, Ireland, and more than half of modern France. In fact, the family's continental possessions were significantly larger than England itself. Richard ruled these lands under different titles. He was king in England, but in France, he was Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. Interestingly, this made him a vassal of the French king for those French lands. England was just one piece, albeit a wealthy and prestigious one, in a vast cross-channel patchwork of personal domains. The modern criticism of Richard as a bad English king for his absenteeism is therefore anachronistic. It imposes the expectations of a modern nation-state onto a medieval feudal reality. Richard's identity was forged in Aquitaine. His primary political power base was on the continent, and his most cherished inheritance came from his mother. His domains were vast and constantly threatened, particularly in France, and spending the majority of one's time defending those continental heartlands wasn't neglect. It was the fundamental job description of a feudal king to protect his subjects. In this system, his English subjects had no particular precedence over his continental subjects, and from a personal perspective, he likely felt more connection to his French subjects. Fundamentally, Richard was an Angevin prince, who also happened to wear the English crown. When Richard was finally crowned King of England in September 1889, his mind wasn't on English governance. Instead, it was thousands of miles away, in the Holy Land. His one, all-consuming ambition was to take up the cross and lead the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to the great Sultan Saladin in 1187. This personal obsession was the primary driver for his first, longest, and most famous absence. After his coronation, he remained in England only long enough to prepare for this conflict, departing in the summer of 1190. He would not set foot in the kingdom again for more than 4 years. To finance an enterprise as colossal as a crusade, Richard treated England with the unsentimental pragmatism of a banker. He viewed the kingdom as a cash cow, a source of funds to be milked for his grander purposes. He was able to do this because England possessed a remarkably efficient and centralized system of administration and taxation. This was a legacy of his Norman predecessors that was unmatched in most of his French domains. While his French domains may have technically been far wealthier, as a percentage of economic output, less of this ended up in the royal coffers comparatively. Richard's fundraising campaign was swift and ruthless. He emptied the royal treasury, which his father had filled with funds from a special Saladin tithe, which was collected almost exclusively in England in 1188. He raised taxes and sold off anything of value. Official positions, lands, and other royal privileges were auctioned to the highest bidder. In a move that demonstrated both his focus and his detachment, he sold Scotland's oath of subservience back to its king, William the Lion, for an extremely hefty sum. As later scholars have noted, he likely would have sold London itself if there was anyone who could afford it. The crusade itself explains not only the duration of his absence, but also why his return would be so fraught with peril. He proved himself a military commander of considerable genius. On his way to the Holy Land, he conquered the kingdoms of Sicily and Cyprus, securing vital supply lines. He arrived at the long-stalled siege of Acre in June 1191, and with his energy and expertise, brought it to a successful conclusion within weeks. He then led the Crusaders to a brilliant victory over Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf. Yet, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained out of reach. More damaging in the long run, however, were the powerful enemies he made among his supposed allies. He deeply offended King Philip II of France, his chief rival, who abandoned the crusade early to return to France and plot against him. At the siege of Acre, he publicly humiliated Duke Leopold of Austria by tearing down his banner, an act of arrogance that the Duke would neither forgive nor forget. This act of extreme disrespect would be a direct cause of Richard's further absence from his holdings. Richard's journey home in late 1192 was a desperate affair. With the French king blocking the direct sea routes, he was forced to take a perilous path up the Adriatic Sea. A storm wrecked his ship, forcing him and a few attendants to travel overland in disguise, straight through the territory of his new enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria. Duke Leopold was, to put it extremely mildly, extremely upset at the level of disrespect he had been shown at the siege. In December 1192, near Vienna, the disguise failed. The King of England was captured and thrown into Leopold's castle at Dürnstein. Soon after, he was sold like a prize commodity to an even more powerful foe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who also bore a grudge against the Plantagenets. Richard's imprisonment created a dangerous power vacuum that his enemies rushed to fill. His own brother John, whom Richard had never fully trusted, saw his chance to seize power. John formed a treacherous alliance with King Philip of France. While Richard languished in a German prison, Philip launched a full-scale assault on Richard's vital territories in Normandy, and John attempted to raise a rebellion in England. The two even conspired together and offered the emperor a truly massive sum of money to prolong Richard's captivity. And I'm not exaggerating here, they offered the Holy Roman Emperor 18 tons of silver just to prolong the event. In modern terms, this silver would be worth $20 billion today. However, to use more relevant contemporary comparisons, historians have estimated that this amount could fund 10,000 knights and their households for 1 year. In essence, the future King John and King Philip were willing to hand over extreme wealth to their already extremely powerful neighbor. But then things got worse, and the price to actually win Richard's freedom was beyond staggering. Emperor Henry VI demanded 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown, the equivalent of almost 40 tons of silver. And at this point, I need to remind everyone that this could have all been avoided if Richard simply respected Duke Leopold's flag at the siege they won together. In terms of monetary value, Richard's lapse of judgment or extreme pride may have been the most expensive act of disrespect in human history. Raising this ransom placed a crippling burden on England. It required a 25% tax on all income and property, the confiscation of gold and silver treasures from every church in the land, and other special levies. For the second time in less than 5 years, the kingdom's wealth was drained to fund its absent king's foreign affairs. The conspiracy between John and Philip revealed the inherent weakness of the Angevin Empire, and also reveals why many historians are uncomfortable with the term empire for it. It was a dominion held together only by the personal authority and presence of its ruler, with each component maintaining its independence outside the personal union. Richard's time in England as king consisted of two fleeting visits. The first was for his coronation and to launch his crusade fundraising, lasting from September 1189 to the summer of 1190. His second visit was even shorter and somehow even more businesslike. Ransomed and released, he finally landed in England in March 1194. He stayed just long enough to perform a second symbolic coronation to erase the humiliation of his captivity and to formally forgive his treacherous brother John. However, the main purpose of his visit, and why he had to issue the apologies, was because he was really in England to gather even more money. He was about to take the fight back to King Philip, his arch-nemesis, and by May 1194, he had sailed from Portsmouth to France, never to return. The final 5 years of Richard's life were consumed by a single grinding purpose: fighting a relentless battle against Philip II to reclaim his lost French lands. While many modern people see this as yet another foreign adventure, to Richard this was a battle for his homeland. Normandy was the ancestral core of the Angevin inheritance, and Aquitaine was his personal domain and the land of his youth. He was fighting to defend the territories that defined him, his family, and his power. In this final campaign, his martial genius was on full display, and he systematically reversed many of Philip's gains and fortified his lands. Fittingly, Richard would perish in the heart of his French domains. In April 1199, while besieging the minor castle of Chalus-Chabrol in Limousin, part of his beloved Aquitaine, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. His body wasn't brought back to England, but rather, he was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, forever cementing his identity as a great continental lord of the Angevin dynasty. The historical consensus is clear. Richard the Lionheart wasn't a bad king in general, but perhaps was a bad ruler of his English holdings in particular. He was a masterful soldier king and a shrewd leader capable of inspiring extreme loyalty and commanding the respect of both his friends and foes. His priorities, the crusade and the defense of his French lands, were perfectly logical for a 12th century Christian warrior prince. He was a product of the Angevin political system, a French feudal lord first, an English king second. Ironically, it was Richard's very absence that secured his legendary status in England. He wasn't present to be blamed for high taxes or the mundane struggles of governance. Instead, he became an idealized, offstage hero, the good King Richard of the Robin Hood legends. He was a perfect and romanticized foil to his brother John, whose tyrannical and disastrous reign was an all-too-present reality for the English people. Richard the Lionheart was, in essence, the cool, absentee dad of medieval England. His rare visits home were dramatic. He'd return like a hero, raise money for his campaigns, or resolve disputes with flair, then head back out. He'd also tell some cool stories about his conquests, and promise that if you just gave him some funding, he'd come back and tell even more cool stories in the future. Meanwhile, his younger brother John was stuck as the everyday parent, enforcing rules, collecting taxes, and making unpopular decisions. And quite frankly, John was terrible at this, both while he was filling in for his brother and while ruling in his own right. My personal opinion is that without the disastrous rule of King John, Richard would have been remembered simply as a warrior king, rather than as a legendary national hero of England. After all, Richard was a great ruler in many respects, but it's hard to make the argument that he acted in the best interests of England in a way that would earn national hero status. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video. Also, if you're in the mood for something different, check out my other YouTube channels or my podcast by clicking the links or in the description below. Imagine a world that no longer exists, not the drained, orderly farmland of modern East Anglia, but a primeval landscape from the 11th century. It was a watery wilderness of swamps, treacherous bogs, and vast, rustling reed beds that stretched to the horizon. This was the Fens, a bewildering labyrinth where mist clung to the water, and solid ground was often an illusion. It was a place where rivers disappeared into murky lakes, and isolated islands of clay rose like ships from a stagnant sea. Survival here didn't depend on the brute force of armies, but on an intimate knowledge of the secret paths and hidden waterways. This landscape was a character in itself, a natural fortress that bred a unique kind of person and a unique kind of rebel. From this mist, a figure emerges, not clearly at first, but like a ghost. He is the embodiment of a conquered people's defiance, the last flicker of resistance against an unstoppable new order. This man is Herwald, a name that would echo through the centuries, later earning the epithet the Wake, which may have meant the Watchful. He stands balanced precariously between documented history and swirling myth. He's a man whose real existence is confirmed by the cold records of his conquerors, yet whose life story is heavily woven from folklore and legend. This raises the central questions that have fascinated historians for centuries. How did a single dispossessed landowner from Lincolnshire become the last best hope for Anglo-Saxon England? Was he a patriotic hero fighting for a lost cause, a ruthless opportunist driven by personal revenge, or something more complex? To understand Herwald, we first have to understand the cataclysm that created him. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel, and at the Battle of Hastings, he shattered the Anglo-Saxon army and eliminated its king, Harold Godwinson. By Christmas Day of that year, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, but his victory was far from complete. What followed wasn't just a change of monarch, it was a systematic and brutal dismantling of an entire world. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost completely erased, its lands carved up and handed to about 180 of William's most loyal Norman tenants-in-chief. Norman French became the language of the court, of law, and of power, while the English vernacular was relegated to the conquered masses. Across the country, Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots were replaced by Norman clerics, seizing control of the church, one of the most powerful institutions of the age. This societal revolution created a deep well of resentment and a class of dispossessed and furious English nobles and local lords. These lords, known as thanes, weren't prepared to take the upending of their social order lightly, and rebellion was inevitable. In the years immediately following the conquest, uprisings flared across the kingdom. William's response to these challenges was swift and merciless. His campaign to crush the northern rebellions, known as the Harrying of the North, was an act of incredible brutality that laid waste to vast swathes of Yorkshire and beyond. By the time Herwald began his fight, he was not the first to resist, but he would be the last to lead a large-scale, organized rebellion against the conqueror. Our firmest anchor to his existence comes from the conquerors themselves. The Domesday Book, William's great survey of his new kingdom compiled in 1086, records a man named Herewald as a landowner in southwestern Lincolnshire before the conquest. He held lands as a tenant of the powerful abbeys of Peterborough and Croyland, placing him squarely in the fenlands he would later make his fortress. This is the bedrock of fact upon which the legend is built. His parentage, however, is a matter of intense debate. The earliest detailed account of his life, a 12th century Latin text called the Gesta Herewardi, names his father as Leofric of Bourne, a local Lincolnshire nobleman. Later, More romantic tales tried to connect him to the famous Earl Leofric of Mercia and his wife, Lady Godiva, but there is no historical evidence to support this prestigious lineage. More compelling is a modern theory suggesting he was of Anglo-Danish heritage. This theory claims that his father was a prominent Danish thane named Asketil. This connection isn't a minor biographical detail. It's the geopolitical key that unlocks the strategy of his entire rebellion. It explains how an otherwise obscure local lord could summon a Danish fleet to his aid, attempting to reignite the old Anglo-Scandinavian alliance that the Norman conquest had shattered. His fight was not just for a lost England, but for a lost Anglo-Norse world order. According to the Gesta, Harold was a handsome, bold, but fiercely rebellious youth. His disruptive behavior was so extreme that his own father petitioned King Edward the Confessor to have him declared an outlaw and banished from the kingdom at the age of 18. It was during this exile that he forged himself into the warrior who would later defy the Normans. He traveled to Flanders, where he became a highly successful and respected mercenary in the service of Count Baldwin V. The stories from this period are filled with legendary embellishments, including a story about him combating a giant bear. Harold returned to England sometime between 1067 and 1069, a seasoned warrior returning to a home he no longer recognized. He found his family's lands seized and given to a Norman lord, his father dead, and his brother slain. In fact, according to the Gesta, his brother's severed head was impaled on a spike at the gate of their own home, as a grim warning. This deeply personal tragedy was the spark that ignited the Fenland Rebellion. The Gesta tells a story of brutal, symbolic revenge. Harold, with a small band of followers, is said to have infiltrated a feast where the Normans responsible were celebrating their new acquisitions. Finding them drunk and mocking the English, he exacted his vengeance, slaughtering 15 of them and replacing his brother's head on the gate with those men. This act, whether entirely factual or not, became a foundational legend of his resistance. From this moment of personal vengeance, the rebellion grew. Harold established his base of operations on the Isle of Ely, a large clay island that was a natural fortress, surrounded by the impassable marshes and waterways of the fens. It quickly became a magnet for the last remnants of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The crucial moment came in 1070, when King Svein II of Denmark, sensing opportunity in the English turmoil, sent a fleet to the English coast. Harold, likely leveraging his Anglo-Danish heritage, forged an alliance with them. Their first major joint operation was an attack on Peterborough Abbey in June 1070. This was a deeply controversial act, and the motivations were complex. The official justification was to, quote, rescue the abbey's vast treasures from the hands of its newly appointed Norman abbot. While this does sound like a very convenient excuse to steal large quantities of treasure from a sacred space, there was some truth to this. The Norman abbot who had been appointed to watch over the abbey was embezzling the funds it generated and making himself fabulously wealthy in the process. The raid on the Golden Borough, as Peterborough was known for its wealth, was a stunning success. Unfortunately for the Anglo-Saxons, the Danes, having secured an immense hoard of gold and silver, got in touch with their Viking heritage. They promptly accepted a bribe from King William, abandoned Harold, and sailed for home, leaving the rebellion stripped of its main military force and its newfound treasury. This act of betrayal was a devastating blow. Despite the departure of the Danes, Harold's defiance had captured the imagination of the beleaguered English. His reputation grew, and Ely became the final rallying point for those still willing to fight. The most significant figure to join him was Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, a high-ranking Anglo-Saxon noble who had been displaced by William's regime. Morcar's arrival, along with other fugitives, transformed Harold's campaign from a local uprising into the last large-scale, organized Anglo-Saxon rebellion against Norman rule. However, the rebellion wasn't winning the hearts and minds of everyone in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. While the sacking of Peterborough had secured a fleeting victory, it came at a terrible cost. The act of desecrating one of England's holiest sites led to the excommunication of the band of patriotic rebels. It ensured that the primary record keepers of the age, the monks of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at Peterborough, would forever paint him as a villain. He lost the narrative war, alienating potential pious supporters and tainting his legacy in the historical record for centuries to come. By 1061, William the Conqueror could no longer ignore the festering rebellion in the fens. Taking the threat with the utmost seriousness, he marched his army to the edge of the marshes and took personal command of the siege of Ely. What followed was a clash of worlds, the brute force of Europe's finest heavy cavalry and infantry against the cunning guerrilla tactics of a local leader using his environment as a weapon. The dramatic, if somewhat fantastical, accounts of the siege read like an epic. The Normans, accustomed to open field battles and sieges of castles, were utterly confounded by the terrain. Their first major effort involved constructing a massive timber causeway, said to be a mile long, to launch a direct assault on the island. The attempt ended in disaster when the structure collapsed under the weight of armored knights and their horses, sending hundreds of soldiers plunging into the swampy depths to drown. Harold's tactics were born of this landscape. When the Normans tried again to build a causeway, Harold had his men hide in the reeds and set them ablaze, engulfing the attackers in fire and smoke. Perhaps the most bizarre tale from the siege involves the Normans resorting to psychological warfare. They allegedly constructed a wooden siege tower and placed a witch atop it to hurl curses and spells at the English defenders. In a moment of pure folklore, Harold and his men reportedly managed to set fire to the tower, causing it to collapse and eliminate the witch. These stories, while likely embellished, speak to the perception of Harold as a resourceful and cunning leader, capable of outwitting his powerful foe at every turn. In the end, however, the fortress of reeds fell not to Norman swords, but to Norman silver. Frustrated by his military failures, William turned to a more subtle weapon: bribery. He approached the monks of Ely Abbey, who, perhaps fearing the destruction of their monastery or seeing the futility of the resistance, accepted his offer. They betrayed Harold and showed the Norman army a secret, safe path through the marshes. This act of treachery sealed the rebellion's fate. William's victory demonstrated a core tenet of his statecraft. Subversion and the exploitation of internal divisions are equally effective tools of conquest. Surrounded and betrayed, the stronghold was finally captured. Earl Morcar was taken prisoner and would spend the rest of his life in a Norman dungeon. But in one last, legendary act of defiance, Harold and a small band of his most loyal followers slipped through the Norman lines, vanished into the wild fens, and escaped. This final escape, noted in all the earliest sources, was the moment the man disappeared and the myth was born. What happened to Harold the Wake after his dramatic escape from Ely? His disappearance created a vacuum that was eagerly filled by storytellers, each crafting an ending that suited their own time and political purpose. Two main contradictory narratives emerged in the decades that followed. The Gesta, written in the early 12th century, provides the most romantic conclusion, fitting of a heroic fighter who comes to accept that the new order can't be overthrown. In this version, Herewald eventually attempts to make peace with King William. He's provoked into a fight, captured, and imprisoned, but is soon freed in a daring rescue by his loyal followers. His former jailer, impressed by Herewald's character, speaks to the king on his behalf. William, respecting the spirit of his indomitable foe, finally pardons him. Herewald is allowed to reclaim his lands and live out the rest of his days in peace, even marrying a wealthy Anglo-Saxon noble widow named Alftruda. And yeah, I suppose I probably didn't have to specify that a woman named Alftruda was an Anglo-Saxon. And as a brief aside, I have to wonder when the last time a baby was named Alftruda, though I suppose I could be inviting a Bort situation in the comments here. A darker, more tragic ending is offered by the Anglo-Norman poet Geoffrey Gaimar in his History of the English, written around 1140. He claims that Herewald lived for a time as an outlaw in the woods and fens. As he was on the verge of finally making peace with the king, he was ambushed and treacherously slain by a group of vengeful Norman knights. According to this version, they couldn't forgive the losses he had inflicted upon them. Lacking any definitive evidence for either of these literary accounts, the modern historical consensus is more prosaic. Most historians believe the most plausible scenario is that Herewald simply succeeded in his escape. He likely fled to the continent, living out his life as an exile, his ultimate fate unknown and unrecorded. He vanished from the pages of history, becoming a blank slate onto which later generations could project their own hopes, fears, and ideals. This version of events is supported by the fact that Herewald definitely had connections to the continent. Fleeing the British Isles entirely would put significant distance between himself and his Norman foes. Herewald's journey from a documented Lincolnshire thane to an enduring national folk hero is a testament to the power of resistance. The verifiable facts of his life, his landholdings, his exile, and his leadership of the Ely Rebellion provided the historical nucleus around which a much larger legend could grow. In the centuries that followed, he became a potent symbol of Anglo-Saxon defiance against what became known as the Norman yoke, the sense of oppression felt by the conquered English. His story of a dispossessed noble fighting injustice from a hidden base in the wilderness established a powerful archetype in English folklore. He is, in many ways, a clear forerunner to the Greenwood outlaws who would follow, most famously Robin Hood. In the end, Herewald's failure was inevitable from the moment the Danes withdrew their tepid support for his campaign. He was a man fighting against the unstoppable tide of history, a local leader standing against the organized might of a new and ruthless state. Yet his legacy endures not because he won, but because he fought. He represents that timeless spirit of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. His very elusiveness in the historical record is the ultimate source of his power as a legend, ensuring he would roam the misty marshes of England's collective memory forever. Imagine the scene in Coventry. The streets of an 11th century English town, normally bustling with the noise of the market, are eerily silent. Every door is barred, every window shuttered. The town holds its collective breath. Through these empty lanes rides a lone figure on horseback, a noblewoman, her face a mask of determined resolve, her only covering the curtain of her own long hair. This lady's husband has agreed to lower the taxes for the town on the condition that she engage in this bizarre act, and all the townspeople have agreed to avert their gaze. This is the image of Lady Godiva, a picture of profound sacrifice, a woman willing to endure the ultimate public humiliation to save her people from the crushing weight of her husband's taxes. The story has been repeated as fact now for almost 1,000 years, but historians question whether the tale of Lady Godiva's ride has any truth to it whatsoever. The first step in separating fact from fiction is to get her name right. The woman we know as Lady Godiva was, in her own time, called God Gifu. It's an Old English name meaning God's gift, and the name Godiva is simply a later, Latinized version that stuck. God Gifu lived through one of the most violent and unstable periods in English history. Born in the 900s, her life spanned the reigns of no fewer than 9 different kings. She lived through the reign of Ethelred the Unready, through the Danish conquest, and all the way to the Norman conquest of 1066. She was a witness to the death of Anglo-Saxon England and the birth of a new Norman dynasty. God Gifu wasn't just a bystander to these events. She was at the very heart of English power. She was married to Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, who was one of the 3 most powerful and influential men in the entire kingdom. Leofric was a formidable political figure, a kingmaker who was instrumental in securing the throne for Harold Harefoot after Canute's death in 1035. Together, Godgifu and Leofric were a true power couple, controlling immense wealth and territory. Their family was a dynasty in its own right. Their son, Elfgar, inherited the earldom, and their granddaughter, Eldgith, would go on to marry King Harold Godwinson. This would make their granddaughter the last Anglo-Saxon Queen of England. Here, we encounter the first major collision between the legend and the historical record. The story of the ride depends entirely on the idea that Godiva was a virtuous, but ultimately powerless woman, able only to plead with her husband to show mercy. The real Godgifu was anything but powerless, and unlike in later centuries under Norman rule, Anglo-Saxon law afforded women significant legal and economic rights. Crucially, they could inherit, purchase, and own property entirely independently of their husbands. Godgifu was one of the wealthiest landowners of her era, amongst both men and women. She held vast estates in her own right across the heart of Mercia, in regions like Leicestershire, Warwickshire, and Shropshire. The most definitive proof of her status comes from the Domesday Book. This massive survey, compiled by William the Conqueror in 1086, was designed to record exactly who owned what in his new kingdom. The survey was conducted after Godgifu's death, yet it still lists her extensive pre-conquest land holdings. Remarkably, it identifies her as one of the only Anglo-Saxons, and the only Anglo-Saxon woman, to have remained a major landholder after the Norman invasion. This is a stunning testament to her influence and power, a status so immense that even the new Norman regime had to formally acknowledge it. But the most critical fact of all is that the small but growing settlement of Coventry was one of Godgifu's personal estates. It belonged to her directly, not to her husband Leofric. This historical reality presents a fundamental challenge to the legend. The story of the ride was first written down in the 13th century, nearly 200 years after Godgifu lived. By that time, the more patriarchal legal system of the Normans was firmly in place, which tied land ownership to military service and heavily favored male inheritance. A 13th century monk would have viewed the world through this lens, naturally assuming that the Earl, as the man, held ultimate authority over all lands and taxes within his domain. The legend he recorded, therefore, isn't just a fanciful tale. It's an anachronism. It projects the legal assumptions of the Norman world back onto an Anglo-Saxon past where a woman wielding independent power to that level had become almost unthinkable. So, if Godgifu was such a prominent figure, why is there no mention of her famous ride in any document from her own time? This is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence against the story's historicity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a detailed year-by-year account of events in England, is silent on the matter. No contemporary records of any kind refer to this extraordinary and scandalous event involving one of the realm's most important noblewomen. For nearly 200 years after her death, Godgifu was remembered as a pious benefactor of churches, along with her husband. The story of the ride appears for the first time, seemingly out of nowhere, around the year 1235. It was recorded in a Latin chronicle called the Flores Historiarum, or Flowers of History, compiled by a monk named Roger of Wendover at St. Albans Abbey. Wendover and his successor, Matthew Paris, were known for being enthusiastic collectors of folklore. Interestingly, Wendover's original version is quite different from the one we know today. In his telling, Godgifu does ride through the marketplace covered only by her long hair. However, she's not alone, but rather attended by two knights, also traveling on horseback, who shielded her from view. Over the following centuries, the story was retold and refined, with each generation adding new layers that heightened the drama and moral clarity. First, the two knights who accompanied her were quietly dropped from the narrative, leaving Godiva to ride completely alone and amplifying her courage and personal risk. Later, the detail was added that Godiva herself had ordered the townspeople to stay inside and not look, transforming the story into one of mutual respect between the lady and her people. The most famous addition to the story, however, came much later and would be one of the standout features of the legend. The character of Peeping Tom, which is where that phrase comes from, was added in the 16th century. Peeping Tom agreed not to look, along with all the other townspeople, but he was rendered blind as divine punishment for sneaking a peek. It changed the story from simply a tale of economic injustice to a morality narrative about the consequences of disrespect. When we place the fully formed legend alongside the historical facts, the entire narrative structure begins to collapse. The story is riddled with inconsistencies and anachronisms that make it historically implausible. First, there's the problem of the place. The legend is set in Coventry's bustling marketplace. But in the mid-11th century, Coventry was a tiny settlement, little more than a village with a population of a few hundred people centered around the monastery. It simply wouldn't have had a large public marketplace for such a dramatic ride. The chroniclers were describing the Coventry of their own time when it did have a large marketplace to ride through. Second, and most importantly, is the problem of power. As we've seen, Godgifu personally owned the estate of Coventry. Under Anglo-Saxon law, if a local toll was oppressing the residents, she possessed the legal authority to reduce or abolish it herself. The central conflict of the legend, a wife pleading with her husband, is based on a complete misunderstanding of her actual power. Simply put, Godgifu was the one who held all the cards in Coventry, not Leofric. And while he certainly could have influenced her, this was her holding, not his. This is, of course, working under the assumption that this was a tax which the Earl was entitled to levy personally. Third is the problem of the tax itself. Some accounts suggest the levy in question was the Heergeld, or army tax. This wasn't a local toll invented by a greedy earl. It was a national land tax levied by the king to pay for the defense of the entire realm against Viking invasion. As a royal tax, Earl Leofric's role was simply to collect it. He had no authority to cancel it for a single village. An appeal would have had to go directly to the king, making Godgifu's protest to her husband pointless. Finally, there is the problem of Leofric's character. The legend requires him to be a cruel ruler of his domain, yet historical sources paint a picture of a shrewd and respected statesman whose marriage to Godgifu was a partnership, evidenced by their many joint religious foundations. Finally, there's the problem of what he has her do. Anglo-Saxon England was heavily based upon honor, and having a wife who engaged in salacious and scandalous activities would be seen as a mark upon Earl Leofric's character. By forcing his wife of all people to ride through Coventry in such a state, by the logic of his own time, he was in essence engaging in a self-humiliation ritual on a grand scale. If the ride never happened, historians have tried to understand how such a strangely specific story came to be. One theory is that it was simply just made up by the chroniclers, and they grafted on a popular and well-known historical figure to make it more interesting. Under this theory, essentially they did the medieval equivalent of adding a popular public domain character like Dracula to a video game or movie. However, the most plausible theory suggests the legend is a dramatic misinterpretation of a common act of Christian penance. In Anglo-Saxon England, individuals who had committed serious sins could be assigned a public penance. A central element of this ritual was humility. A high-status penitent would be required to appear in public stripped of all signs of their rank. They would walk barefoot, dressed only in simple plain clothes, without any jewelry or other markers of their nobility. For a powerful countess like Godgifu, being seen in public without her finery would have been a profound act of humility. Under this theory, Godgifu, who was a highly religious person, even by the standards of the time, may have participated in such an act of penitence. This act was then misinterpreted through a game of intergenerational telephone, when Roger of Wendover came into contact with the story. From there it was embellished and reframed. In the final analysis, the historical consensus is fairly clear that the ride of Lady Godiva almost certainly never happened. Even though it contains no overtly fantastical elements, it's almost certainly just as much of a legend as a tale of a knight confronting a dragon. The historical Godgifu was a real person. She was a powerful, pious, and influential Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who left her mark on the historical record through her wealth and her faith. Lady Godiva, the legendary figure, is an icon of compassion, courage, and economic justice, and while she's based on her, the historical Godgifu and the figure of Lady Godiva are separate.